Hi, Kindred. As you have heard many times now, we are nearing the end of this countdown. So this is probably one of the last few weeks that I'll be up here teaching before I take off for a little while. And so I'm thrilled that you're here tonight, that we get this time together. Hopefully, maybe I get to teach one more time, but we don't know. So truly, though, this is one of my favorite things in the whole world, getting to preach. And so I know I'm going to be a little preoccupied for a while with, trying to keep like a newborn alive. But I also think I'm going to miss this so incredibly much. And so I am soaking up these next 30 minutes for all they are worth. So we have been journeying our way through the book of Hebrews, this ancient letter written by an unnamed author to a group of first century Jewish believers. And the writer's goal is simply this. It's just to encourage. It's to encourage these Jewish Christians not to give up faith, not to give up hope in Jesus and his new way of life for them. And there's plenty of reasons why some of these Jewish Christians had begun to doubt if Jesus was really worth following anymore. And their reasons truly aren't all that unfamiliar to us. Like the uncertainty that many of them were facing as their faith was evolving, it was scary and it was unsettling. It was also dangerous. It was costing them relationships, and it was foreign. And so when we feel out of control or uncertain, we tend to cling to the things that we know. We go back to old behaviors or old patterns because it's where we feel comfortable. And so for many of these believers, it was their Jewish way of life. It was these Old Testament rules and religion that brought them this sense of comfort and security. It was something they knew well. It's also just in our nature to drift. When we're not paying close attention to our thought life or to our patterns or to the people whose voices we've invited into our lives, we tend to drift. We get easily distracted, and then we replace the best thing for us, which is Jesus, with something else that is seemingly good, or maybe with something else that's unhealthy, or even wrong or sinful. And so the author's strategy in encouraging his audience that is experiencing this kind of doubt has also been pretty simple so far. It's just to remember who Jesus really is. And so over and over again, he points to Jesus in this effort to try to re-inspire these Hebrews of just how much better, how much greater, and how superior Jesus really is. And so far, we've seen him do this with angels. We've seen the author do this with Jewish heroes of the Old Testament, like Moses and the infamous story of the Exodus. And then tonight, we're going to pick up in chapter 4, where he's going to apply this same strategy as he explores how Jesus is the ultimate high priest. Now, for the original audience, it went without saying that priests were an important and a vital fixture in Jewish life and in Jewish faith. So the original audience would have been very familiar with the functions and the responsibilities of a priest. They would have known the very long history of priesthood in the Old Testament and the role that they played in this large story of God's people. But for many of us, we likely don't have that level of shared context for priesthood, unless maybe you grew up Catholic. Right, then you might be a little farther along than the rest of us in this department. Right, but Hollywood and movies and TV shows have kind of contributed to maybe our construction of priesthood. And so for me, the first thing I might typically think of when I even hear that word is I picture Robin Williams in like the outfit in the 2007 movie License to Wed. Nobody else has seen it? Anybody? Thank you. It's not that great. But this is what I picture him. Right, but priesthood, it's about much more than the robes and the outfit and whatever, silly movie has kind of put in our head. And it's important for us to bridge this cultural gap because we're not starting in the same place that our original audience was. See, the ancient Israelites, they had earthly high priests. And these elect, they were tasked with going before God on behalf of the people and offering sacrifices for the sins of the people. There was this really clear separation and distance between a very holy and perfect God and his imperfect people. And so the Israelites, they accepted and understood that there was this need, that they had a need for intercession and representation. So they needed someone to stand before God on their behalf because they recognized that they couldn't stand before him. And so this was then the purpose and the very unique calling of priests all throughout the Old Testament. It was just to represent people to God, to bridge that separation or that distance by offering these sacrifices that would then reestablish their good standing with God. And this had to be done over and over and over. And so unlike the first century audience that this letter was written to, this is something that I think we culturally have a more difficult time accepting and embracing. Because in the West, and especially in America, we value independence and self-reliance and this pull yourself up by your bootstraps approach to life. Right? It's called the myth of meritocracy, that we are able to get where we are in life exclusively all on our own effort. This is, I believe, one of our great hurdles in our relationship with God, because we often apply this kind of thinking to our faith. And so it leads us to think stuff like, well, we can earn acceptance from God, or that we could somehow work off or pay back our forgiveness with good behavior, that we can prove we're worth loving with all of our rule keeping. It convinces us that our own merit, our own ability to be good and our own strength, that it will count for something then when God looks at us. And it causes us to reject the idea that we might need someone else to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. And so our cultural values tell us that we don't need anyone for anything. Only count on yourself, and if you just work hard enough, well, then you'll get there. But the irony in all of this is that there are actually plenty of spaces where we gladly accept intercession and representation. I think about the few times that I've been asked to appear in court, usually as a character witness, and I read a statement, right, on behalf of either a friend or a coworker or someone who's asked me to be there. And standing before a judge, whether it is for a serious offense or a silly traffic violation, it is absolutely intimidating. A courtroom to me is terrifying. I won't even be on trial and I will feel scared. Like, have I done something wrong? So in a court of law, right, the accused is almost always has representation. Right? They have a lawyer. And this lawyer is an intercessor. Right? They speak for them. They answer for them because legal jargon is a language all of its own. Right? But this lawyer, it represents, right? They represent their client's interests. They go before them. They stand in this gap and they navigate this space with confidence. Right? And a good lawyer usually makes all the difference. I also think about the few times that I've traveled to Mexico City on a mission trip. Right? And to be honest, I was totally helpless on my own, like beginning the moment we land, from having to navigate the airport, to find our hosts, to then just make it through the week in another country that speaks another language with a bunch of high school students who were looking to me to lead them. And so I was always so grateful for our translators, right? Because they spoke for us. And they acted on our behalf. They stood in the gap for us when we didn't know the customs or the culture or what was expected of us. And our translators, they held the trust of these communities that we were able to work with. And then we got to be included as this extension of that trust. And so without that help, without their representation, we would have been absolutely lost. right? In our own effort, no matter how hard we tried, it would have been totally useless. And so I think in some of these ways, we can identify and we can accept our need for someone to go before us, right? Someone to speak for us and act for us and represent us when otherwise we would be totally helpless. And so similarly, right, nothing about us qualifies us for acceptance from God. Nothing we do can earn us more love or belonging or favor. Sin has made us pretty helpless before a holy and perfect God. The good news is, when we trust in Jesus, all of his effort and all of his goodness and all of his perfection, it actually qualifies us then. It counts for us. It gets credited to us, and it covers us. Right, but first, we have to admit that we're needy. We're needy for his intercession, and we're needy for his representation. We need someone to go before us. We are in need of a high priest. And so this is where we're going to now pick up in chapter 4, where Zach left off last week. This is in verse 14. It reads this: "So then, since we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we believe. This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he faced all of the same testings we do, yet he did not sin. So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it most." So there's a lot going on here in just a few verses, so we're just going to break them down a little bit. Okay, first, the author is setting up this really interesting juxtaposition. So in verse 14, he writes that we have a great high priest who has entered heaven. Other translations say that he has passed through heaven. And so being the Son of God, Christ has unique access to God in ways that the priests that came before him did not. And this access that he has as the Son of God, it enables him to be in the very presence of God, right? To be in the presence of his perfection, right? In ways that these other priests would have been restricted. Jesus is actually able to enter into heaven, to be in God's presence, to stand before him on our behalf. And we should also note then that his nature as the Son of God makes him eternal, right? And this is significant because it means then that there's no end. There's no limit or expiration date on Jesus' ability to go before us, to intercede for us. So we don't have to fear that we're going to lose this representation. We can be assured that it's something that's ongoing. It is going to last forever. It's not going to count for us one day, and then we'll lose it the next day. And so verse 14 sets up that Jesus is able to reach upwards into heaven, into eternity. And then verse 15 explains that he is also able to reach downwards, right, towards us, towards earth, by saying this, right? This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he faced all of the same testings we do. Right? A few of these testings are made really clear to us in Scripture, like in the beginning of the book of Matthew, right? When Satan tests Jesus with wealth and with power and with comfort, right? During these 40 days in the wilderness. Or we see the moment in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's the night before Jesus is going to be arrested and executed. He's tempted to avoid suffering, to want to choose a less painful path. Yet I think we are still confounded by this. I think we read something like this and think to ourselves, there's just no way that this could still be true. Like, Jesus cannot possibly relate to my specific temptation. And our opposition, it's usually tied to our unique experience. So Jesus cannot relate to me because there was no social media in his day. He couldn't understand that. Or Jesus can't relate to me because I'm a woman and he was a man. Jesus was never a parent or a spouse. He was never elderly. So how is it that he can relate to me if he has never lived in my unique experience? Right? And sure, Jesus didn't struggle with things like likes and tweets and DMs, right? But we have to dig just a little bit deeper here. We have to go underneath a few layers. And we have to examine our temptation for what it truly is. And so when I want to filter my life, when I want to present a picture or a perception that is really not at all close to the reality for me, the temptation is validation or success or popularity. It's just taking the shape of a post and a like and a follow on Instagram. And so at the root of all of these different temptations that we want to believe distances us from Jesus are actually these tests that are universal to the human experience. Will we rely on ourselves or will we rely on God? Right? Will we believe what God has said is true, or are we going to believe something someone else has said is true about us? Will we trust that God will take care of us, or will we put our trust in something else? In money, or influence, or success, or fame, or sex, or fill in the blank? Right? These tests may have taken a very different shape for Jesus, but he was in no way exempt. And so the writer's emphasis of Jesus' humanity here, his weakness, as he puts it, it is intended to draw us nearer, closer into Jesus, not to alienate us further from him. And I think in these moments, what we want most is to be validated. I think we want to be validated in our struggle. At least I do. And some of the most damage to our relationships happens when we admit to struggling or we admit to temptation, and when what we need is compassion and sympathy, and then instead we're met with judgment or cruelty or a lecture. I think what we're often looking for, right, when we know we've messed up, when we know we're losing this battle to temptation, is for someone to just understand us, to understand that this is difficult, that this is trying for us. It's for someone to just look at us with some compassion and to say, I get it. Right? And I get it is not I condone it or I excuse it, but I get it. I see you. And I see what it is that you were wanting there, what you were going for, and how some things got twisted up and it led you down a dark path. Jesus gets it. And this makes him the perfect confidant. He has been up against the same test, the same choice, when we peel some of those maybe cultural or contextual layers back. And every single time he will meet us with compassion. We won't have to justify or beg or plead with Jesus for his sympathy. Because he gets it. He actually understands, and he can meet us in that struggle with grace and mercy every single time because he himself has been there. And so our great high priest empathizes with us. Our author then moves into chapter 5 by continuing to draw out these differences between earthly priests and Jesus, setting him above and apart from all the rest. And so chapter 5 begins with this. It reads, every high priest, which notice it's not capitalized now, so we're not talking about Jesus, is a man chosen to represent other people in their dealings with God. He presents their gifts to God and offers sacrifices for their sins. And he is able to deal gently with ignorant and wayward people because he himself is a subject to the same weaknesses. That is why he must offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as theirs. And so similarly to the priests that came before him, and like we just talked about, Jesus is able to relate to our humanity. And so priests experienced the very same hardship and sickness and loss and just the mundane of day-to-day life that the people that they were caring for were experiencing. So this meant that they could relate, right? And that they were to then care for the people in their care. But unlike Jesus, right, they had to offer sacrifices on their own behalf too, because they weren't without their own sin and their own flaws and their own shortcomings. But because Jesus never sinned, this gives him then the power to not only just relate to us, but also to save us. Earthly priests didn't have this kind of power. Right? They were limited by their humanity. But Jesus, because he lived as the perfect human, it actually makes him then the perfect sacrifice on our behalf. The author goes on to write, and no one can become a high priest simply because he wants such an honor. He must be called by God for this work, just as Aaron was. That's Moses' brother. That is why Christ did not honor himself by assuming he could become high priest. No, he was chosen by God, who said to him, "You are my son, and today I have become your father." And in another passage, God said to him, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." So a priest couldn't appoint himself, but he had to be called by God. And so these verses are intended to demonstrate Christ's posture, that he didn't assume this title on his own volition, that even though he had the same power and authority of God, he didn't presume to give himself this title of high priest, but instead he repeatedly humbles himself. Right? In Philippians, it says it this way: he doesn't consider equality with God as something to cling to or grasp, but that he actually gives up his divine privileges and he takes on the qualities of a servant. So it's God who elevates Jesus into this role of high priest. And the author uses two quotes from Psalms to kind of prove how Jesus didn't take on this role himself, but that it was designated to him, emphasizing the humility of Jesus. And it's meant to say something to us about priesthood, right? That it's about service. It's not about position or title or superiority. It isn't come to by ambition of oneself or influence or success, but it requires this special appointment by God. It requires this call and then the humility to follow it. So let's finish just the last few verses in this passage. It says, while Jesus was here on earth, he offered prayers and pleadings with a loud cry and tears to the one who could rescue him from death. And God heard his prayers because of his deep reverence for God. Even though Jesus was God's son, he learned obedience from the things that he suffered. And so in this way, God qualified him as a perfect high priest, and he became the source of eternal salvation for all those who obey him. And God designated him to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Right, so priesthood is uncomfortable. It's a call to service, and it's a call to be close to people's pain. And Jesus himself was not exempt from experiencing pain. It's thought here that the author is alluding to this scene we've already talked a little bit about once tonight in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? When he is so tormented, he is so tortured even by what he knows lies in front of him, that he is asking God if there is any other way to redeem the world. If there's another way to conquer sin and death and evil for good, for all time, without having to go to the cross, without this crucifixion, right? Well, then let it be that way instead. And we are meant to once again here recall that Jesus is familiar with anguish, that over and over again he was faced with the choice to abandon his purpose, right? To choose a different way. And this just might be the most extreme example we have of him in a moment like that. And these verses, they read that he learned obedience from the things that he suffered, which kind of makes it sound like maybe at one point Jesus was disobedient, which is not what the author is getting at. It's more to say that he experienced, that Jesus became well acquainted with this profound obedience because of the kind of death he would have to suffer. That he knows what it is to wish for another way and then to be told no. And then by choosing to stay the course, we are then profoundly transformed. Right? Which gets us to verse 9, when it says that our high priest became the source of our eternal salvation. It is precisely because of his choice not to abandon us to our own sin, to have to pay the consequences on our own, right? To face this incredible pain and suffering. Our salvation required it. We are then afforded this forgiveness and this belonging with God. It is because Jesus stood where we could not, right? Bearing the weight of all sin for all time, for all people, that all of his faithfulness in that moment, all of his obedience, all of his absolute perfection and righteousness, it then counts for us. It covers us. So then when we are unfaithful, when we are disobedient, when we are unrighteous, then we are still covered by Jesus. Right? He is the source of our salvation. It doesn't come from within us. It comes from outside of us. We also see in these verses the second mention of Melchizedek, right? Which is a character I would assume not a lot of us know a ton about. And so it seems a little confusing, or it might trip us up when we read this. But ultimately, this is just another attempt of the author to try to prove to this Jewish audience that Jesus is above all things, including all of these other priests. And so Melchizedek holds this special significance in the Old Testament. And some of his importance is explained a little bit later in chapter 7. But sparing you some of the author's honestly really long-winded history of Levitical priesthood and other things, what we're meant to see, right, is that Melchizedek, it was just a foreshadowing. Right? He was just a foreshadowing of Jesus. That like Jesus, he is the only other person who will hold both the office of priest and king. Right? But we see Jesus become the high priest and the King of Kings. And his name and title together actually means King of Righteousness and King of Peace, which are two things we will come to know Jesus by. And so Melchizedek was a great priest, highly revered by the Jewish people, but he was no Jesus. He was only meant to point forward, right, to this thing that would ultimately be better. Okay, so what are we supposed to ultimately take away? Right, from all of this talk of priesthood? What does it matter that Jesus can reach up into heaven and also down towards us? What does it mean that Jesus is able to empathize with us in every test, in every temptation? What do we care that he became the perfect intercessor and representative for us in his sacrifice? Well, the answer is in actually something we have already read. It's back in chapter 4, verse 16. So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it most. So it means that we can approach our God boldly, with confidence, with assurance, and that at his feet we will not find punishment or condemnation or judgment, but we will be sure to find grace. We are sure to find help when we need it most. And so my question then becomes, is this how you approach God? Do you approach him boldly, with confidence? Or do you approach him with timidity and some fear and some reluctance? Do you anticipate that God is disappointed in you? Do you anticipate anger or wrath or a raking over the coals? And would knowing that Jesus has experienced every temptation you have change the way you approach him? Would it comfort you to know that in every struggle, Jesus understands that he is actually able to validate that struggle? He is able to say, I get it, I understand. Might it give you some assurance that because he has been there himself, he's not going to belittle you, but he's going to empathize with you, that you don't have to be afraid to approach him. You don't have to hide from him. You don't have to run from him. Would knowing that because Jesus chose not to abandon you, even in his deepest suffering, that he secured this salvation for you, making it so now that when God looks at you, he doesn't see your sin or your mistakes or your flaws, but he actually sees the faithfulness and the goodness and the perfection of his own son, Jesus. Would that ease whatever hesitation or fear you hold around going to God? Because he's not holding your sin against you. You're totally covered by Jesus. This is the gift and the beauty and the power of Jesus as our high priest. I love the way commentator Raymond Brown puts it in his commentary. He writes, for the Christian, so for the one who trusts in Jesus, the throne of grace is the place of help. It's not the place of ridicule. It's not the place of cruelty. It is not the place of anger or judgment, but it is our place of help. And so what has kept you from his help? What has held you back from boldly and confidently going to God? And what might change about how you approach him if you had just a little more confidence in Jesus as the one who has gone before you, as your intercessor, as your representative? What might change about how you approach God?